by Savantas Policy Institute, Stanford GSB Chapter of Hong Kong, and Stanford Club of Hong Kong. So we are honored to have Professor Bruce McKern speak to us this evening. So first of all, may I invite our co-organizer, Mrs. Regina Ip, and Mr. Ronald Eason, and Ms. Christina Hu, and come forward to give a souvenir to Professor McKern. Please. So may I now invite Mrs. Ip to give a welcoming remarks and introduce our speaker. Mrs. Ip, please.
Thank you, Jermaine. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this innovation seminar. I have great pleasure in introducing Professor McKern because he was my professor, you know. And I remember him well because he gave me a good grade for doing very little work.
Because you were very clever.
Doesn't this room remind you of our Sloan classroom?
Yes.
Good. So we're delighted to have Professor McKern with us, you know. He was a Sloan professor. He taught at Stanford GSB. He taught me international economics. Then he became director of Sloan program, and he did many other things in between. Currently, he's a visiting fellow at Hoover Institution at Stanford. And he's a visiting professor at International Business China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai. I didn't know you've been traveling all over the world, you know. And he's a visiting research fellow at the Technology and Management Center for Development, Oxford University. Well, anyway, Professor McKern is a big draw, you know. This is one of our best attended events, you know. We have a lot of Sloan alum. We have doctors, you know, professors, and we have the Australian Consul General, Nick Yang from the government, James Lau, the Undersecretary for Finance, and other distinguished guests from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and other institutions, you know, apart from our many distinguished alums, you know. So we're really greatly honored to have you, Bruce. And we look forward to your presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you how China does its innovation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Regina, for that lovely welcome. And I'm really pleased that you gave me the gift first. Because if the gift had depended on my doing a good job, you see, I might not have got it. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Sloan and Stanford alumni, distinguished representatives of the Hong Kong government and business, Australian Consul General, and others, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's really a great privilege and honor for me to be here, and I really enjoy the opportunity to talk with you a little bit about what we've learned concerning innovation in China. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. So I really would like to encourage you to think about questions or comments you'd like to make, and we'll do our best to have an interactive discussion, because that's very much in the tradition of Stanford University and, of course, of the Sloan program. As Regina mentioned, I was teaching in the Sloan program for many years in international business. And I remember Regina very well, and I've seen her, of course, many times since those days. But she fully deserved the grade she got in that course, I can tell you. In those days, she didn't show as much interest in politics as she does today. but she certainly had the intelligence and the interest in world affairs. So it's wonderful to see what you've been doing with your career since then, Regina. Let me turn then to the topic of today's discussion, which is innovation in China. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that our main focus of what we've learned over the last 3 years is that Chinese companies have learned how to innovate. They've done so very much by what we call incremental innovation, not radical, disruptive innovation, although there is some of that. And for that reason, sometimes people say, China can't innovate. You hear a lot of that in the press and other places. In fact, sometimes when I'm talking to a Chinese audience, they will say, why don't we have a Steve Jobs? Well, I'm going to show you that China did have its Steve Jobs once a long time ago. But the more important point is, how many Steve Jobs are there? How many countries have Steve Jobs? Only one. And there's some reasons why the US had a Steve Jobs. And so there are good reasons, I think, why China will eventually have its Steve Jobs. But it already has many people who are great innovators, and I think that that will continue. So the main message, I think, of the book that I've just finished doing with Georgia, which will be published next year, which I hope you'll buy, the main message is that China can innovate and is innovating, and it's now moving into a new stage where it's taking its ideas to the rest of the world. So let me try to explain why I say that. I want to mention, first of all, 3 phases in the way in which Chinese companies have been innovating over the last 20 to 30 years. I first came to China in 1981. And in those days, of course, as those of you who were alive at that time will recall, things were very, very quiet. And it was just the beginning of the changes that were introduced by Deng Xiaoping. And what really struck me there, as I gave talks in Beijing and Xi'an and Shanghai, a couple of other places, what really struck me was that although I was talking to an audience where everybody was still wearing a blue uniform, I sensed that there was an enormous potential there, just waiting to be released. And that's what happened with the Deng Xiaoping reform. I went to the first Sichuan textile mill in Chengdu, and the manager said, this is a wonderful thing for us. He had a huge factory, he had 20,000 people, he had schools and hospitals and all of the things that those companies had in those days. He said, this is a wonderful thing because for the first time, I can do something with the profit I can make. It doesn't all go back to some place in Beijing. He said, I can build another school, or I can pay my workers more, I can invest in some more machinery. So what has happened, I think, is that latent entrepreneurship, which you see every day here in Hong Kong, was released. And the result of that is what we're seeing in the enormous changes that have happened at that time. I mean, what other country in the world, in the space of 5 years, has built the largest high-speed rail service in the world? It's an extraordinary achievement. We tend to take it for granted, but it's there. And I spend a lot of time, I'm based in California. And California has been thinking for the last at least 10 years about building a high-speed rail from Sacramento to Los Angeles. Hasn't done it yet, but if it does, it'll probably be built by Chinese entrepreneurs. And that's a kind of interesting sort of circle, isn't it? Because the cross-continental railway that was built across the United States back in the 19th century was, the last stage was built by Chinese who came and did the laboring work on those rails. So it'll be a nice symmetry. So I want to talk about the 3 innovation phases. I want to talk a little bit about what is driving those, and then talk a little bit about the capabilities that Chinese companies have developed. So let me try to do that. Now my first question is, I must be going the wrong way. No? Okay. That's my question for you. What do you think that is? It's just a question to test your visual acuity. Speak up, sorry. Some kind of earthquake measuring. It's a very good idea, but it's not. But it's needed. Any other ideas?
It's a clock. It's a clock.
A clock. Who said clock? It is. And at the time, it was the most advanced clock in the world. And this clock was built by China's Steve Jobs. And China's Steve Jobs was Su Song, who was in the Song dynasty. He was a diplomat, he was a polymath, he was a very educated man, he was a poet, he was also an inventor. And he built this clock. It's about 12 meters high. It was powered by water, and it had a very sophisticated escapement mechanism, which no other clock had in the world at that time. And it also had astronomical measurements as well. So that was China's Steve Jobs. And I simply do that by pointing out that there was a time when China led the world in innovation. It lost its way for many reasons that we know about, and is now recapturing that. And so to suggest that China can't innovate is really just silly, I think. Of course it can innovate. 1.3 billion people are going to be able to innovate very well, and this is an example of what was done then. Of course, there were many, many other innovations, such as the compass and gunpowder and fireworks and ships with sails and rudders and all of those sorts of things we take for granted. So let me move on to talk about the, I hope I can get this right, yes. Okay, the three innovation phases. We think are, first of all, copying to fit for purpose. People talk about China as being a nation of copiers. Well, copying is a very long-standing profession. And if you look at the developments of innovations all over the world, there's a lot of copying in the US, a lot of copying in Germany, and so on. All of this happened in the past. I'm not encouraging it, but I'm saying that Chinese firms learnt about innovation, first of all, by copying. You have to learn how to do something before you can make it better. And they moved very quickly to what we call fit for purpose. Some people call that good enough. But I think good enough is a kind of derogatory term. And I think fit for purpose is much better because they learned how to make products that had just the features, just the qualities that people need and no more. And they were willing to pay that amount of money for. So Chinese entrepreneurs, in our view, have been extraordinarily good at sensing what the market wants and finding ways to deliver that at a reasonable price. And in the process, they've made the market just explode. So that's the first step. The second is what we call followers to world standard. So from following multinational, following ideas from other parts of the world, they've now developed the ability to make products and services at world standard. And the third is the last phase, which is moving from the search for natural resources, minerals and petroleum, into entering foreign markets and looking for knowledge. And I want to come back to that. So let me start off with the first phase, which we spoke about briefly. In that phase, there were, I think, two very important drivers, which are pretty obvious when you look at them. One of them, of course, is the market. And we call that customers. To make things easier for ourselves, we just use 4 words that start with C. It's a little bit, a device, but it makes it easier for us to remember. So the first one we call is customers. And the huge market in China, which of course was very small in 1981, but with the release of energy that happened, it exploded very quickly. That's been a huge driving force. And it's been aided by the fact that Chinese customers initially were looking for cheap products, they're looking for something they could afford, but they very quickly upgrade. And they keep looking for better products and turning things over. They're not very concerned about keeping something over a long period of time. As soon as they can get a better product, they'll go for it. And so companies had to work very hard to provide what those customers needed. And there were a number of other companies that were very quickly plugged into global supply chains, working for big companies that were delivering products to final consumers. And those companies were held to very, very tough standards by their customers. The customers were wanting quality of the absolutely first class. So in both of those ways, the rapidly growing market, the opportunity to serve into global value chains was a very important driving force to make people grow. And the third one is what we've called culture, but it means much more than culture in the general sense. We mean the whole set of values and attitudes and behaviors, both in the private sector and in government, that has pushed people to want to build a better future. And that's something you see every day when you walk in the streets in Shanghai. You see people optimistic about the future and struggling hard and fighting hard to make it better. And so that includes the entrepreneurial drive of the people who start small companies, many of which fail. They go back and start another one. It includes the CEOs and the employees of bigger companies which have succeeded. And it includes also the governments very visionary drive to create a sophisticated scientific and technological ecosystem. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So those are the big drivers which in the process of working their way through the system have created a substantially modern science and technology infrastructure in China, which then helps entrepreneurs and larger companies to get the R&D inputs they need to innovate, and which in turn creates within the companies the skills and the capabilities, which is our third C, capabilities, which enables them to continue doing what they've done successfully and learning from it, and then taking those ideas abroad. So let me move on a little bit and talk about this first phase. The first part of it was low cost. Companies had to start from scratch. And there were examples of the Shanghai companies in neighboring Shenzhen and other parts of the area. Some of them still there. Those companies, some of them made very shoddy products, some of them made better products, but they learned very quickly through a very tough competitive market. There's some people outside China, I was talking to somebody just today about that, and they were saying, well, you know, companies all have this support from the government. Well, the people I talk to say, no, that's not true. Yes, we can go to maybe a technology park and we can pay for some research or something to be done by somebody, but the government isn't giving us money to actually start like this. We're fighting dog and dog with other companies. And many companies will tell you that. So they became very quick at learning. If they didn't learn, they died. And so that was a really tough Darwinian sort of environment. Their competitive advantage was low cost, yes, but they very quickly realized that they had to understand what their customers wanted, because their customers were looking to improve the quality of what they got all the time. And very quickly in that marketplace, quality was what mattered. So they went to what we often call good enough products, but I prefer to call them fit for purpose. And if you think about many of the products that you see around the marketplace, some of them don't have the, the extra bells and whistles that you might get, but they are satisfactory for what is needed. A good example is a Swiss-based company that came into China with very sophisticated food processing equipment. And it found that it couldn't sell it because it was too expensive. And it had too many features which its customers didn't really need. And so what was their solution? They found there were competitors, Chinese local companies, that were making exactly what the customers wanted. Yes, they didn't have all the automation, they couldn't run 24/7 and so forth. But the customers didn't want that. They wanted something that was a little bit simpler, easier to maintain, and did the job. And so this company found that its own engineers could not bring themselves to make such a product. So they had to acquire one of the Chinese companies, and that's worked very well for them. So good enough to me is not the right term, it's fit for purpose. And Chinese entrepreneurs have been very good at doing that precisely. So as a result of that, they became very good at incremental innovation, not breakthrough innovation, but really good innovations, and you see what I mean by that. Here are some examples. On the left is the BlackBerry. I don't know whether any of you own such a phone. Now, Barack Obama endorsed it, you see. This is a very typical Shanghai product. And then in the middle, one of those things, that's not tobacco, those are phones, for people who like to smoke, but like their phone to look like a cigarette. But then on the other side, we have the apple peel. Has anybody ever seen that? Is it better by, you know the apple peel? Can you tell us what it is?
If your iPod cannot use this as a mobile device, you can use this with the add-on, and then you can use this for just like a mobile phone.
Yeah, maybe you didn't hear all of that, but you can take an iPod Touch, a simple player, and you put this thing around it, or you add this to it, it does the interconnectivity, and you've got something like an iPhone. And it's only about $100, I think. So you can buy them on the web now if you want one. So that's an example of ingenuity. It's not breakthrough, but isn't it clever that somebody figures out how to do that with a simple piece of addition to an iPod Touch. Here's some other examples. Guangdong Crane, just nearby, has found a way to, instead of having two welds on a piece and on two plates, they can do a single weld. And I think the cranes still stand up, so that's good. Suntech has developed self-cleaning solar panels so that they have more efficiency and don't get dirty quickly. Broad is a very big company in air conditioning and other things, and it's got some new non-electric products. Taobao, and you know very well, all of the things they've done by developing Alipay, developing escrow for their customers, and all of the things that were very new to the market here when they did it. And Haier, I think, is a wonderful example of a great Chinese company. What do you think that is, that particular picture? Anybody know what that is? Oops, I was trying to play this one here. Does anybody want to guess what that is? Washing machine. It is. But it's a very special kind of washing machine, because not only does it wash clothes, it will also wash potatoes. And this is another example of what I was speaking about earlier. Haier had a call from a farmer somewhere out in the western part of China, and he said, "Your machine's no good, it doesn't work." And he went and had a look at it. They said, "Well, of course it doesn't work, it's full of mud. The drain is full of mud." He said, "Well, that's because I wash potatoes in it. Doesn't it wash potatoes?" And instead of berating this customer, the engineer went back to Haier and said, "Look, maybe there's an opportunity here." So now they make this washing machine and you can wash potatoes in it. And that's a typical example of listening to the customer and then doing something about it. And that's very typical of Haier. Haier is, of course, now an international company, but it has never forgotten the value of listening to the customer. And it is one of the first companies in China to practice what people call open innovation, where they invite people to come up with ideas and then they take advantage of them. So those are some examples, I think. And then in the next stage, companies became so good at what they were doing, they were then achieving world standards of efficiency. Already those companies that were in those international supply chains were forced to be at the level of anywhere in the world because their customers demanded it. The tolerances and the costs, everything had to be equal to the best in the world. The companies that were more consumer focused, they were also learning from their customers and innovating under this competitive pressure to make their products better. And so we have examples of companies, Tencent, Lenovo, you know all these names, Sunny, Mindray. Hans Laser you may not know, but they're over in Guangzhou. And he's, I think, the biggest laser company now in China. Started from nothing. He built his first laser, actually his first laser machine, which is a welding machine, here in Hong Kong. He had to bring the parts in, he had to make them in an apartment. And so these are the way these people start. It's a long story. There are many very interesting high-tech startups, and you see them all over China. These are just a couple I've bumped into in Suzhou. The Suzhou has made a focus on nanotechnology in the government R&D centers there. And this one is Suzhou Nano Microbiotech, was started by a young PhD from Beijing University. And it makes very small particles which are very uniform for certain applications where you need that sort of thing for drugs and for delivery of various things. SVG Optronics is another interesting company. It makes very thin films which are used for the Chinese identity card, things like that. So these are just examples of companies which have become world-class in the quality. SVG and Suzhou both sell a lot of their products to multinationals because they are able to guarantee the quality and uniformity of the particles they produce. This is part of the same development. I mentioned Haier earlier. They have expanded to the US, and they did that very cleverly too, because they didn't try to challenge the US manufacturers. They took very small products which were not very glamorous, such as bar fridges and wine coolers, and that was very successful there, and they gradually moved up from there. They now have they're the largest maker of domestic appliances in the world, and they're in all markets. 8 design centers, and that particular product there is one of their ranges, excuse me, which is a very sophisticated range of household refrigerators and other appliances. You can have it covered with Swarovski crystals if you like, do whatever the customer wants. The other thing that Haier did, again, this is understanding the foreign customer. Because of their time in the US, they realized that Americans like ice cream, and they like ice cream not to be too cold. So one of their fridges has an extra freezer compartment which keeps the ice cream a little bit warmer. So when you take it out, it's ready to eat. That's customer attention. Good Baby is another one of my favorite companies. Has anybody ever had a Good Baby product? No, probably not too many of you. Well, some of you with younger children may have. Good Baby is the biggest producer of baby carriages and strollers in the world. But most of its products are not sold under its name, except in China. It's a supplier, an ODM supplier to other companies. But it's also a very interesting company because it listens very carefully to its customers. It's getting feedback all the time. It has design centers in 3 major parts of the world as well as China, because Japanese customers want smaller strollers, and American customers want big strollers, and European customers want highly sophisticated, high-tech strollers. But they're all different, and they design products to suit each of those areas, and then they bring all that knowledge together, both in China and other places, and they improve their product. I met the CEO of the company, and he showed me this particular stroller, which they had developed because they had come across a problem that people often have when they have a baby in a stroller and they've got arms full of shopping and they want to get into the metro or get into a car, and it's difficult to collapse the stroller. This is a one-button press button. So you press the button, the stroller collapses, preferably without the baby in it, and it works very well. So the other thing they did is, you've probably seen some of those terrible videos of strollers rolling onto the metro tracks. Every stroller they sell has a self-limiting brake in it, so it will stop if the baby's not there. So these are just examples of what we would not call radical innovations. They're not world-beating, but combined with their continual search for new ideas and their understanding of what customers want and their efficiency in their operations, they can do all of that and become the biggest in the world. So we're going to hear a lot more from companies like this. Some other examples of business models that companies have developed. Tencent, you know very well how extensive that is with its instant messaging service. And again, what's interesting there is not so much the development of that particular idea, but the way in which they've rolled it out and the way in which they listen to their customers and take the feedback from the customers and then incorporate it into new software, which they then roll out to customers. So there's a lot of customer interaction there which gets fed back into the improvement of the product. UWell's another company. It's in a field that makes small medical devices for monitoring your own health. So blood pressure, things like that, temperature. But these are meant for people who are older and living in their own places, their own apartments, to be able to keep an eye on their health. And so you see they've designed them to look much more like kitchen appliances rather than something medical. That's working quite well for them. Xiaomi, I think you all know, is a company that didn't exist 5 years ago. It's now really one of the great darlings of the young age. And again, what's really great about this company, I think, is that it's not just the phone. I mean, the phone is good, but it's the way in which they have made their customers part of the creation of new applications and new services for the phone. So again, it's listening to the customer, very quick to innovate and put those new ideas to work. And Newsoft, you may know Newsoft, which is a very good computer company, a good software company based up in New York. It is now putting its software into large medical equipment that is monitoring patients, and then that information will be fed into the patient's medical records when there's an integrated system. So these are some examples, and then the third phase is the based on the ability these companies have developed, they're now moving offshore. China has had a go global approach for many years, and the main impetus for many years has been natural resources, minerals and energy. Now that's changing now, it will continue of course, it's important, but what's now changing is a push to enter markets for manufactured goods and services as insiders. And so Chinese companies are now moving offshore into Europe, into the United States, to become multinationals in their own right. Now they have some big challenges in doing that, but the basis for it is the capabilities they've developed here in China, which give them that ability to deliver products quickly to customers, and if they can understand what the customers want more quickly and more efficiently than the companies they're competing with, the big multinationals, I think they're going to have a big challenge. They're going to be a very challenging group, because they have the basis to do that. The natural resource side and also the other developments are going to be helped by the two belts, the new developments. But I think what's more important, I don't think I need you know all about that, so I don't need to talk about it, but what's I think much more difficult today is that when you look at a Chinese company expanding out of China, in the old days it was exporting from China to the rest of the world based on low cost, and then over time innovating and making better products and then exporting those. The difficulty today, I think, is that it's much more difficult to do that. the products themselves are becoming more sophisticated, and the products China wants to sell to the rest of the world are more sophisticated. And yet the barriers to entry are much harder. And so if you only think for a minute at the way in which Huawei has had difficulty in getting its services, its software into some countries. So there are barriers, some of them are political, some of them are to do with the customer, some of them are technical. But the answer to it has to be innovation, I think. And so innovation is going to be a very important part of what Chinese companies have to do over the future, and I think it will be still a very important part of the 13th five-year plan, as it appears. So in this last push, we call it seeking new knowledge, but it's not just knowledge, it's markets and brands that they're looking at. And the technology is the third part of it. Because although Chinese companies have developed great technological skills and abilities, there are areas where they're still lacking. And so when they go to a foreign country, they may acquire something that is needed to fill out their portfolio. So it's not just brands. If you look at a couple of examples, SAIC, Shanghai Automotive Industrial Corporation, bought SsangYong, the Korean car manufacturer. That was a failure because they weren't able, they had lots of problems not understanding the Korean labor unions' power and things of that sort, but also they had great difficulty in bringing that knowledge of design and the technology of building good quality cars out of the company into Shanghai. They tried to drag it back and they couldn't get the people to transfer, it didn't work. So they eventually had to sell out and lost money on it. But you contrast that with Geely and Volvo. Geely is managing Volvo, I think, extremely well because it's seen Volvo as a fine company in its own right. It's investing in Volvo, building a new Volvo plant in China, building another one in India. But at the same time, it's also learning from the design skills and the technological basis that Volvo has overseas, and it's mixing its engineers and scientists together. So the two sides are collaborating, partly in Shanghai, partly in Sweden, and they're letting the business run extremely independently. They manage the board of directors, of course, but they're doing that extremely well. So I think it's allowing Volvo to benefit from the investment, but not to cramp the innovative ability of its people. So this third push is supported by the capabilities and also by the cash that companies have generated, in which the Chinese government is also helping them to borrow. So that's the third stage, and what it's producing, I think, is on the basis of those capabilities and the earnings they've made, the ability to become global competitors in their own right. So let me move on from there a little bit quickly, and I just want to give you some examples in a minute. But these are some of the examples of acquisitions that we've seen in this third phase. It's not all acquisitions. Chinese companies are also going out and establishing R&D centers, establishing operations as greenfields. But in many cases, they prefer an acquisition because they get knowledge about the market. They may even get market share as a result, and quite often they'll get a brand. And so you've seen a company like Sunny, very big industrial equipment company, buying the German concrete equipment company, Putzmeister. And what that did was to round up their product line with a set of concrete pumping equipment and so on, which they didn't have in their portfolio. So that's part of it. You know, the Lenovo IBM acquisition and the more recent Motorola Mobility. Again, in the case of Motorola, it was getting access to a set of patents and ideas which will be useful for the company longer term. The other thing is, I just want to mention at the end here, is that there are a lot of foreign R&D centers now being built by Chinese companies outside. And in Europe, there's a tendency for them to be by acquisition of companies which are very good at manufacturing and which often have a fairly narrow product range. Some of the German Mittelstand companies, the middle-sized companies in Germany, are very interesting targets for Chinese expansion because they're family-owned, they have a long-term perspective, they often have very good export positions out of Germany, and so they fit quite well with some companies wanting to expand to Europe, provided they can work with the owners and make sure that they can work together. Some good examples of that, some not so good. In the US, there's a tendency for companies to be setting up R&D centers close to the major innovation hubs, Silicon Valley, Raleigh-Durham, around Boston, places like that. And the idea there is to get inside the innovation ecology of those places. if you're in Silicon Valley, just sitting in a coffee shop, you absorb ideas, you absorb a feeling about what's happening there. And Regina will know this very well. And so those companies want to be inside that ecosystem, and the best way for them to do it is to have an active R&D center, which may be a joint venture with some other company, or maybe an acquisition, or it may be greenfields. But it's listening and working with companies and actively doing things, and that's the way you develop new ideas. So these four factors underlie the strengths of Chinese companies. And I don't want to go more time on that, but I want to just say a little bit about why China's been so successful. I don't know why this does this, I'm sorry, I want to get it all done. But we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. The reason that China has been such an important hotbed for innovation is, first of all, a huge market. The biggest market in the world now for autos, motorcycles, mobile phones, luxury goods, number two, and home appliances. A lot of empty spaces initially, where companies could jump in, create something, throw it into the market, see how it went. If it wasn't good, they could change it. A lot of those early, cheaper products I mentioned. The big, large-scale government projects, yes, they were important because they provided funding and work for a lot of people and interesting projects, like the large train business. And this growing sophistication of the whole ecosystem, driven, I think, by the government's push to really create strong technologically based centers around the world, around the country. So I've talked about the entrepreneurial spirit. I don't need to go over that again, but I think that's been a really, really important part of why China is investing. But I do want to show you these data here, which perhaps not everybody recognizes, and that is how much China has put in to the funding of the R&D infrastructure in China. Today, it's spending about 42% of what the United States spends on R&D. So that's about right for the size of the economy. It's about 2% of China's GDP, which is more, slightly more than the average of the European Union spending on R&D. Yes, some countries are spending a lot more. Finland spends a lot more as a percent of R&D, some less. But the average in the EU is about 2%. China's total, you can see the figures there, $163 billion US in 2013. So it's substantial. The US is spending more, and the US government's spending more, but China is certainly keeping pace, and that's resulted in the huge system we see. If you look at the outputs of that investment, I mean, that's important. The investment is one thing, but what's more important is what are the results. I haven't got time to show you all these, but I just want to make the point that if you look at publications by researchers in top scientific journals around the world, China's share is rapidly increasing. It's about 14%, I think, at the moment in total. But if you look at some sectors, such as computer science, if you look at chemistry, China's number one. This is in the output of high-quality journal publications. Now, you know, that's not innovation. That's ideas. And what's most important, of course, is if you think about R&D, R&D is turning cash into ideas. Innovation is turning ideas into cash. And so the R&D is part of it, but it's not the whole story. But let me finish on the R&D part of it. If you look at the number of foreign R&D centers that have been set up in China, there's 1,500 of them today. Probably more than that today, 1,500 a couple of years ago. If you look at the technological intensity, the percent of revenue that's spent by Chinese companies on R&D, it's below the average of the top 2,000 global companies. But it's increasing. And that's a good sign. And some companies are well up in the top ranks of the global 2,000. Companies like Huawei, for example, or Haier, or Alibaba, they spend a lot of money on R&D. So the trend is upward in every measure. If you look at patent applications, the Chinese SIPO has the highest number of patent applications per year in the world. It has more than the US today. Chinese invention patents in a higher number than US utility patents, which are comparable. Now, it doesn't mean the quality is exactly the same. You know, we can all cavil about that. But another interesting measure is the proportion of what are called ICT patents. These are, PCT patents, Patent Cooperation Treaty patents. So these are patents that are taken out in the PCT process, which are going to be easier to get applied across a number of countries, but the process is more rigorous. And in that area there, China is also rising. It's about 10% of that number at the moment, I think. And a few companies, 2 companies, are actually number 1 and number 4 in the world in the number of those patent applications they're putting in through that process. One of them is ZTE, and the other one is Huawei. ZTE is number 1, Huawei is number 4. So these are just examples, but I think they show a pattern of how China has been investing in R&D and innovation, and how it's now producing a lot of fruit in the quality and the quantity of what's coming out. So I want to spend for a few minutes just talking about the 35-year plan, if we have a couple of minutes on that, because I think this is just an indication of the direction where I believe China may want to go. And of course, I don't know what's in the 35-year plan. And there are people in this room today who know much more than I do, and I'm hoping they will comment about that later. But I think what one hears, and I've just tried to piece together what I've read and heard from other people, I think innovation will continue to be supported by the government, because several speeches by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have indicated that they will continue. They believe innovation is the source of the ability of the country to move itself up in terms of living standards. But I think what's going to be, I hope will be in the plan, and there have been certainly some hints that this will be the case, is some effort to change the institutional environment in which that takes place. Plenty of people, critical of China, they say, well, it's got an environment where people can't be creative and so on. I don't think that's true. There are just so many creative companies, so many creative people, and they're not being inhibited by the system. Maybe the system could be better if it was different. I don't want to argue that. But the important point is that it may be that there will be some changes in the ease with which a small company can get finance, for example, or the protection of intellectual property, or the legal restrictions for starting a business. In other words, the institutional and economic aspects which can be barriers to a company moving from that stage of having a good idea to actually making it happen. That's where the obstacle seems to be. And if that can be addressed in this plan, and if it can be implemented, then I think that will be a very powerful force for change. Some of the other areas there I think are to be expected. But one of the drivers, I think, is going to be the Made in China impetus, which was put out by the State Council last year, I think it was, in which the Made in China 2025 is an idea to really push China upward in terms of the value added in manufacturing. In other words, to more sophisticated products, and sophisticated products almost by definition are more innovation-intensive products. Because China now knows it can't continue to be successful with low-cost products because its costs are rising. It wants its cost to rise because that means a higher standard of living. So this is a very ambitious plan, and as part of it, there is a review of the whole system in which innovation takes place. So if work is done on those dimensions, I think it's going to be a very important set of changes. I personally would like to see this system more open to foreign investment. Foreign investment has been very important in the early stages of China's development. A lot of it from here, a lot of it from Taiwan, and also from further afield. But I think in the last couple of years, foreign investment has had a more difficult road in China. And I think that's a shame, because I think China can benefit from the technology, the ideas of foreign companies. It can benefit from a competitive playing field. Multinationals aren't asking for a favorable playing field. They did have that years ago, but they want an even playing field. And of course, the rest of the world will benefit. So, and there are some areas where there's been suggestion that foreign investment would be welcome, because funding is short in high-speed rail expansion, for example. So I'm hoping that there'll be something along those lines. I won't spend time on this. I'll leave it just with you to have a look at just some of the scientific areas which I think may also be part of the 13th plan. There are some steps, changes from what we saw before. Agriculture is one that's been singled out for quite a bit of attention. I think probably renewable energy will continue to get some attention, but I think that some of that will be directed towards nuclear power, and along with other areas that we can talk about. I want to finish on just by talking about the capabilities that I think Chinese companies have that have enabled them to be so successful, which they've developed over time, and in which I think they have an advantage over more traditional companies from the West. First of all, as I said several times, great focus on needs of customers, on the local needs of the customers. That's a tremendous advantage when you start to look at other countries, because if you've developed a way of understanding your customers, and if you know those customers are going to be different when you go somewhere abroad, then you'll have the intelligence and the ability to anticipate that, hopefully, and make good changes. The acceptance of the good enough standards. Again, that's something, you know, we talk about a lot in multinational scale. We talk about lean management, lean production processes. The Japanese invented that years ago, but we talk a lot about it today. But we don't implement it. We don't implement it as well as we can. Chinese companies have done that. They've implemented it very well. Incremental, not radical innovation. Appropriate for the time. And once you are good at incremental innovation, you can become good at radical innovation. You have to walk before you can run. And the fourth thing is willingness to supply special needs. A lot of the investment in Africa has been adapted to the local conditions there. That applies not only in China but outside China. Use lots of staff. Now, this is something, again, that's an advantage when you have low-cost people, and it's going to be an eroding advantage, but for the time being, a company I know which had a problem where they were trying to solve an issue between the manufacturing in China and the foreign market, they just put 100 engineers onto the problem. And they worked out how to do it in a few weeks. In the West, we might put 10 people on it and wait for 6 months. And that's, we don't have time to do that. People work a lot harder. I've got pictures of people that wear desks in Huawei, for example, with their sleeping bag under the desk, which they're expected to use if they don't get the job done. We see that all over China. When you send an email to somebody, when I send an email to somebody in China, I get an answer back within an hour or so. I send it to somebody in Europe, I get an answer back maybe in a week, maybe 2 weeks in the US. So there's an acceptance of doing things quickly and doing away with the formality of processing. Now, part of this is because the boss is important, as I mentioned further down. The boss pushes people. There's more of a boss culture here, certainly, in China. Some people say, in China, in the West, it's about 50% boss, 50% everybody else. In China, it's probably 70 or 80% boss and 20% everyone else. But that won't work forever, and it doesn't work with every company, because as your business becomes more complex, you can't have a command and control system to do everything. And so that will change. And I think a good indicator of that is what Haier is doing. They've created, their CEO, Zhang Guimin, has created 2,000 responsibility centers across the country. And he's trying to push delegated power down to those centers so they can respond faster, and so they can be more innovative, and so they can give their customers what they want. I don't know whether it'll work, but it's a great experiment. And the interesting thing is that he's willing to try that. So all of those factors, I think, make Chinese companies very different from Western companies and give them a big advantage. And they're ideas that Western companies can learn from Chinese companies. These are just a couple of examples. I won't go too far with it, but this is myself and my colleague, George Yip. We're sitting side by side. We're watching the same television screen, but we're seeing different programs. So the same bed, different dreams. That's it. We're wearing glasses which enable us to see two different images, and we have earpieces. So this was invented by TCL for Chinese customers who might have a pretty small apartment and some difference of opinion about what they want to watch in the evening. So you can both watch the same screen but different. Joyoung is famous, I think, for its soy milk maker. It invented that. And it's continued to improve that product. Of course, it has lots of competitors, and multinationals have now copied it. Philips has its soy milk maker. And this is a great company. It's one of the top 3 now in the small appliance companies throughout appliance businesses in China. And it invented that product. So they're just small examples of understanding what's needed and jumping in quickly to satisfy. And this is just the invention. This is my colleague again with the Haier hammer. You may know that story about when Zhang Guimin was in the early stages of the company. he was not satisfied about the quality. And you can see what he says when he gets up in the morning. I refresh myself with 3 words: I'm not satisfied. And he brought his team together. They brought 20 refrigerators off the assembly line. They had very minor blemishes, maybe little scratches. He said, this is not the quality that we want to be known for. And he took the sledgehammer and they smashed the refrigerators. And of course, that's an epic story in the higher hierarchy. So there are many examples of that. Jack Ma, or Mayun, when he was fighting with eBay, he said these famous words, and he used a different way of dealing with her. He was just more nimble, he was quicker. He called it the ants way. The little ants can fight quite well against a big creature if they work together. And of course now he's the big creature himself, so he has to watch out for the ants. So they're just some of the examples of how successful these companies are. And this feeling about Chinese capabilities is echoed in surveys that we've done with the consulting firms. This is done with Bruce, but I won't go through it. But what's interesting is that both multinationals and Chinese companies, but particularly multinationals, are saying that Chinese competitors are as good as or better than they are at innovating. And so this, I think, is recognition that by those companies that they face a really tough business on the ground. I'll leave this with you to have a look later on. So key ideas I just wanted to bring across to you today are Chinese companies have gone through this process of evolution, from copying right through to now seeking new knowledge. They've developed those 10 areas of management capability where they have an advantage. And these 4 important features have made that possible, particularly the market and the attitude, the culture, and the ability to learn from what they've done to create those capabilities. And the implications of multinationals, if you're a multinational, is that there's a lot of reason to be here. Because if you don't learn from the Chinese environment, from those competitors, they'll be coming into your markets with those skills and those capabilities. Yes, they have to learn about your customers, but they have the ability to understand customers, and they know they have to do that. So they're going to be very tough competitors for you. And so you should be in this market if you're not here, and if you're already here, you should be looking to innovate in this market, do more to learn from your customers, because some of those ideas you'll be able to take to the rest of the world and into your home markets. So China is becoming not just an innovative base for China, but for the world. That's my story.
Thank you very much, Professor McKern. So now we will have the discussion section. So if you have any question or comments, please raise your hand and we will pass the mic. So this gentleman here.
Thank you very much, Professor McKern, for your very stimulating talk. Your ideas resonate strongly with me, so I don't have much question on that. What I would like to ask you about is the extent, since we're in Hong Kong and you're doing this talk in Hong Kong, the extent to which Hong Kong manufacturing firms that are located in Guangdong province, in particular in the Pearl River Delta area, the extent to which these firms, the Hong Kong-owned manufacturing firms, are riding this wave of innovation. Are they innovating to the same extent that domestic, indigenous, mainland Chinese firms are, or are they being left behind?
Right. I wish I could answer that, but I'm going to actually ask the gentleman in the front row